All right. Hello and welcome to State of Play on MintPress News. I am your host, Greg Stoker. And in terms of global affairs, we are still waiting on an Iranian response to the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. The Ukrainian army has launched a brazen attack into the Kursk region in western Russia with a tiny force of 1,000 men with assorted armor, artillery, and air support. It could be more, though, since that is coming from Russian media. But either way, it looks like a PR stunt, and they can't hold that ground for long with that many men. People are saying it's a feint, to redirect Russian troops for the real offensive. Again, with the manpower shortage that they're having, I don't know what that would even look like. So that's why we're saying serious PR stunt vibes, public relations vibes. So to generate more pro-war propaganda, just to keep it going, because that seems it's what we do now. We just keep wars going. We've been doing it for a long time, and that's not going to change. So anyways, today we are going to be covering the U.S. interference, or why the U.S. interference in Venezuelan elections has failed again, and opposition anti-Maduro grievances from the opposition. We are going to talk about those. It is a contentious subject, and we're going to do our best to thread the needle, right? But the comment section could get spicy. But before we get into our main segment, I just want to say, hey, we're on Patreon. If you want independent journalism that has absolutely nothing to do with corporate mainstream media, check us out on Patreon. $5 a month does help, and do that if you want to. If not, we're just glad you're here. Click the like button so it shoots it up in the algorithm, so hopefully more people can check this out. Anyways, thanks so much. Now, before we begin our main segment, as I said, Kamala Harris made this huge faux pas at a rally in Detroit, Michigan, of all places, a heavily Arab American swing state in the coming U.S. Presidential election. So, sorry, I forgot to prep this video because I'm a bad student who didn't get my homework together. Here we go.
Surrender our fight against the climate crisis, and he intends to end the Affordable Care Act. You know what? If you want Donald Trump to win, then say that. Otherwise, I'm speaking.
Mm-hmm. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Karen La is about to ask to see their manager. Okay. She is not happy. Look at that. Look at that stare. Okay. So I just wanted to say things like people were shocked somehow by this response. They thought it was really tone deaf. It's really not surprising at all. So Kwame Ture was a civil rights activist and was very formative for the civil rights movement. And he had this to say about liberals, and liberals are not always white people, as we're coming to find out. So I'm going to post a couple quotes in here because it just talks about this perfectly, what we're saying. So let me put this in the comments section. MintPress. Here we go. There's one. And There's 2. Okay. Many people, Kwame Ture said, many people want to know why, out of the entire white segment of society, we want to criticize the liberals. We have to criticize them because they represent the liaison between both groups, between the oppressed and the oppressor. The liberal tries to become an arbitrator, but he is incapable of solving the problems. He promises the oppressor that he can keep the oppressed under control, that he will stop them from becoming illegal. In this case, illegal means violent. At the same time, he promises the oppressed that he will be able to alleviate their suffering in due time. Don't be hasty. Don't rush things. Historically, of course, we know this is impossible, and our era will not escape history. So, yes, we're talking about blue MAGA, and there's one more quote about confrontation. Like, everybody just wants to be really comfortable, right? Posting this real quick. And it's about like liberal comfort and what they will do to maintain it. So we're seeing the reason the liberal seeks to stop confrontation, and this is the second pitfall of liberalism, is that his role, regardless of what he says, is really to maintain the status quo rather than to change it. He enjoys economic stability from the status quo, and if he fights for change, he is risking his economic stability. What the liberal is really saying is that he hopes to bring about justice and economic stability for everyone through reform that somehow society will be able to keep expanding without redistributing the wealth. The more things change, the more they stay the same. So I don't want to spend too much time on the Kamala Harris bad optics faux pas. It just goes to show you that even though she promised to talk about, maybe doing a ceasefire to hear Palestinian Americans' concerns about, genocide, her spokesperson today said she is not contemplating an arms embargo on Israel. And she also had a nice sit-down conversation with Benjamin Netanyahu. So, I don't know why people are thinking that she's doing any of this in good faith. They're just being classic liberals, as Kwame Ture would put it, just maintaining the status quo and threatening you with, do you want to see democracy destroyed? It's like, if that's how you have to threaten it, maybe it's not actually democracy. Anyways, speaking of democracies and not democracies, we are on Venezuela right now. So let's get into it. So after a typically contentious election, the overthrow of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro appears nowhere in sight. Now that the electoral audit is in the hands of the nation's Supreme Court, it seems the Biden administration is softening its language regarding the recognition of Edmundo Gonzales as the winner of the July 28th election. Regardless of how one feels about the current government of Venezuela, it does not appear to be going anywhere anytime soon. However, it is important to recognize and examine the grievances of the opposition to Maduro's administration, since the Venezuelan diaspora and certain classes within the country itself so heavily and universally revile and detest Maduro. So Maduro is, what do they say? Maduro is a left-wing communist dictator. He consistently rigs and steals the election. The administration is completely and hopelessly corrupt, rife with cronyism, nepotism, and backroom deals. There's a crackdown on non-state-sponsored media, and dissidents are sent to re-education centers, aka torture camps. So while the U.S. sanctions and interventionism are making things worse for Venezuelans, they say, the buck stops with Maduro and his Chavista supporters. This is the story told by the Western media and many Venezuelans, especially in the diaspora. But what about the other half of this polarized population, the Chavistas and the political left? So is there any truth to these claims? It is an open secret that the United States has been trying to implement a regime change in Venezuela for 2 decades following the Bolivarian Revolution and the election of the socialist president Hugo Chavez. Traditionally, the U.S. interference in Venezuela has been attributed to the vast oil reserves that the Chavismo movement nationalized, thereby denying American and European energy corporations unfettered access to the country's most important and exploitable resource. Installing a right-wing neoliberal government would undoubtedly fix that problem, of course. So, however, this reason alone, right, is too superficial for why U.S. would want to get involved. It's not just about resources. Chavez, and to a lesser extent his successor Maduro, was seen as a leader of the, quote, pink tide, a turn towards left-wing governments in Latin American democracies that was seen as anti-American, populist in nature, and in opposition to liberalization reforms, particularly those of the IMF and the World Bank, which we tend to associate with debt colonialism as a form of neo-colonialism. So, therefore, Venezuela has been a direct challenge to U.S. hegemony over the American continent, and solving the abiding Venezuela problem is a foundational geopolitical objective for the United States. Tonight, we examine the grievances against the Chavismo government, whether or not it stole the election, the damage of U.S. sanctions against the Venezuelan people, and why the United States will have to wait some time before trying again to install a more right-wing compliant government in this critical geostrategic American country. So regardless of how one feels about President Maduro, we can all agree that countries deserve the right to self-determination without rapacious imperial interference. So, yeah, we can talk all day about how this is a dictatorship, but maybe we should just get the boot off their neck. You know, that is also an option. So today we're going to be talking to someone who was just there. This is a pre-recorded interview because he's in East Asia right now. So we had to do this super early in the morning, but I will be in the comment sections answering questions and providing links and research and data. So let's get started with this one. All right, so let's talk Venezuelan elections, U.S. interference, and the socio-political polarization of a society. Seems to be a common global trend right now. So today we are joined by Alan MacLeod, senior staff writer and podcast producer for MintPress News. He was an academic and a freelance journalist specializing in Latin America and in analyzing media and propaganda for years. So thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about Venezuela.
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Great to be with you.
Yeah, and I know you were just there for the elections where Maduro ostensibly won, according to like the mainstream media. But last week, the U.S. government on Thursday recognized Venezuelan opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzales as the winner of the South American country's presidential election, discrediting the results announced by the electoral authorities who declared President Nicolas Maduro the victor. And then Anthony Blinken said in the statement, quote, "Given the overwhelming evidence, it is clear to the United States and most importantly to the Venezuelan people that Edmundo Gonzales won the most votes in Venezuela's July 28th presidential election." So now 2 days ago, State Department spokesperson Matt Miller started to walk back some of his boss's statements here, like the language around the election being rigged changed from like definitive, like hard and soft, hard language to some more, they just started to walk it back. Let me play this clip real quick.
Is the U.S. ready to recognize another interim president similar to what happened earlier with Guaido, or is it more just a matter of not recognizing Maduro as the victor?
That's not a step that we are taking today. Where we are today is we are in close contact with our partners in the region, especially with Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia, about a path forward. We continue to urge the Venezuelan parties to begin discussions on a peaceful transition back to democratic norms. We continue to call for transparency and the release of detailed tally votes, while recognizing it's been over a week since the election, and any release of those votes would require close scrutiny given the potential for tampering or manipulation in that time frame. So no, that's not a step that we've taken as of yet, but we continue to make clear that the will of the Venezuelan people needs to be respected, and that's what we're engaging with our partners in the region about.
Okay, so yeah, less decisive language, a lot of gymnastics going on there. So what exactly is someone with not a lot of knowledge or history of the region and Venezuela supposed to make of all this? Because that's the question we've been getting asked when putting together this show about Venezuela.
Sure. Well, I guess the background is that ever since 1998, when Hugo Chavez won the election in Venezuela and started to carry out what he called the Bolivarian Revolution, which was basically the process by which Venezuela would use its enormous oil wealth to fund social programs and help the poor of the country rather than send that money to investors in the West. Ever since then, the United States has been on a mission to try and dislodge this government. And pretty much every election that has come round, the US has played some sort of shenanigans saying that there was irregularities or refusing to accept the results or recognizing someone else as president. Venezuela's had more than 20 elections in the last 20 years. And pretty much every time the United States has cried foul, certainly the local opposition has. The US has backed or participated in more than 10 coup d'etat attempts against the government as well. There was an assassination attempt against Nicolas Maduro in 2018 that the US may or may not have been a part of. But certainly it greenlit the 2020 Bay of Piglets invasion of the country, where a bunch of quote-unquote former ex-special forces guys, Green Berets, went over to Venezuela with a bunch of mercenaries, tried to shoot their way to the presidential palace and install Juan Guaido, who was the US recognized self-declared president of the country. They tried to install him as president. The US has never really accepted Maduro as the president. In fact, when Maduro was first elected in 2013, the US cried foul about those elections as well, and those proved to be inaccurate claims that the US had made. And in fact, it was the only country in the world that refused to accept or recognize Maduro as the legitimate president. So in the past few years, we've been playing this ridiculous game of political limbo in the country where the US actually recognizes a parallel government led by Juan Guaido. They did that for a number of years. It never really went anywhere, but Guaido certainly got a lot of the funds that the United States was able to muster for Venezuela. They got those basically by seizing Venezuelan assets in the US or internationally and then transferring them over to the opposition. So I guess this is just the latest chapter in the ongoing war between the United States and Venezuela.
Right. And so there's this overriding impression, as we were talking before we started recording this. I mean, I grew up in Texas around like a lot of people from the Venezuelan diaspora. I've lived in other parts of the world with people that have fled Venezuela, economic reasons, political reasons. So I kind of grew up with this sense that everybody like pretty much hates Maduro. He's this left-wing dictator who does, I mean, it's not just the mainstream Western narrative that, you know, he's stealing elections. A lot of diaspora Venezuelans that I have come in contact with have said the same thing. We're seeing a lot of anger on social media about this election from Venezuelans. And I'm just going to play one video so just the audience gets a sense of like what like some of the common grievances are.
Nada que me dé más arrechera que un maldito comunista de primer mundo. No tiene ni puta idea de lo que pasa en Nicaragua, no tiene ni puta idea de lo que pasa en Venezuela, pero te viene a explicar a ti, como ciudadano de esos países, lo que sucede, porque ellos sí saben. Unos hijueputas desde Italia, desde Suiza, desde Francia, desde España, que te vienen a decir a ti lo que es el comunismo y por qué es bueno. ¿Sabes qué es bueno? Que tú, maldito comunista, te calles la puta jeta. Cuando pases hambre, ahí me vienes a hablar a mí de comunismo, imbécil.
Okay. There's also some more articulate videos. I just couldn't find them. So there's this recognition that a lot of people in the diaspora have that, you know, U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, Venezuelan oil products, you know, and we can get into sanctions in a second, are a factor. But a lot of those U.S. sanctions that are kind of creating like harsh economic conditions inside Venezuela are actually not oriented towards Venezuela. Like the ones in 2019, they're at Maduro and his like cabinet ministers and not necessarily at the government and the economic apparatus of the country.
Well, sure. I mean, that was actually one of the more cogent members of the opposition diaspora, really. I mean, that's basically how they see it. In the 2013 election, we found that at least 95% of Venezuelans who lived in the United States voted for Henrique Capriles, the main opposition candidate, even though Nicolas Maduro won that election. So it's an extremely ideologically concentrated bubble in the United States. It's a bit like the Cuban American community, the Iranian American community. There's a certain political milieu that they live in the United States, and that's definitely the way they see things. Now, being in Venezuela and talking to people in the left, the Chavistas, as they call the pro-government people, not a single one of them will deny that there is a pretty hefty percentage of the population that absolutely hates them. And sees things completely different to them. But if you talk to people in the opposition, they will insist that they speak for the entire country, and there isn't any sort of population that supports the government, supports Maduro, is left of center, is a revolutionary or anything. And I think that's really quite disingenuous, because when I was down there, what I saw was not only very widespread support for the government, but very enthusiastic support as well. I'll give you one example. On Thursday, the 25th of July, I went down to cover Maduro's final rally in central Caracas. It was the biggest event that I had ever been to, political or otherwise. The reports are that the absolute smallest estimation of the amount of people there was 1.3 million. That's what I've seen. And some people were saying that it was 2 million people were out in the streets, everyone wearing red. I took a 20-minute bus ride to get from the hotel to the main stage. And people were telling me after the rally that the crowds actually started around where my hotel was. So it was an absolutely gigantic rally. I talked to other people, including journalists, international observers who went to the main opposition rally over on the other side of town at the same time. And they told me that a conservative estimate would be that the pro-government one was 5 times the size. So while there is very much the sense in the United States and other diaspora communities around the world that this place is a dictatorship, the government has absolutely no support, inside in Venezuela, it's absolutely plain to see that the government does have very large support. And this support isn't, a bunch of people being bought off by being given, a loaf of bread or half a bottle of rum, like a lot of the opposition people say. You actually talk to people why they support your government, why don't they support the government. The people who are pro-Maduro have very cogent reasons for it. You talk to them, just ordinary people on the street, whether they're, working in service jobs or, in hotels or as cleaners or whatever. They can have a much more nuanced and much more verbose critique of capitalism, imperialism, the US empire than a lot of students in Ivy League colleges can. I really was impressed by the depth of understanding of economics, of politics, and of the way the world works, just from ordinary people on the street that you point a microphone at.
Right. And so how do you account for this social disparity between, as we said, the Chavistas and people in the diaspora and people in Venezuela as well who favor opposition parties? And there are different candidates that we can talk about. There's to different degrees of far right. You have MCM, basically having connections to like Israel and begging for intervention, to a military intervention to install her as the president. How do you account for this massive disparity?
I mean, if we go back to what Venezuela was like before 1998, there is a massive race and class correlation between government support and opposition support. Venezuela was a slave society for hundreds of years. It never had a civil rights movement. There is an awfully close correlation between race and class in those countries. If you go to opposition rallies and just look at people online talking about their Venezuela, what's been taken from them, you will notice that most of those people are probably whiter than I am, actually. It's really stark when you go there and you see the sort of rallies, and you see the people online who are talking about it. Half of them are called Germania Eichmann or something, and they're saying, Venezuela, my country, yearns for freedom or whatever. But
Mhm.
when you go into working class areas, it's mostly Afro-Venezuelans or mestizos or mulattoes or whatever a mixed race identity they go by. That's really the sort of power base for the Venezuelan government right now. So there is this sort of two worlds thing that's going on. There are people who live in the east side of Caracas in bubbles of privilege. A lot of people go around with armed guards. They lived in gated communities. And the sort of people they talk to in their, high-powered jobs, they all see the world in a certain way. It's the way that, it's the way that upper class Venezuelans will see it. But lower class Venezuelans see it in a very different way because they have had a completely different historical and material upbringing to those people. They come from the slums, they come from the uneducated classes who, after the revolution, were taught to read and given opportunities to go to university. So they really see the world in two very different ways. They have different social media, they read different newspapers, watch different TV channels, and it's not entirely unlike the United States, where if you live in MSNBC land, you very much see the world completely differently to people who you're fed a diet of Fox News or Breitbart. And this has been going on for a quarter century in Venezuela. With regards to the diaspora community, well, it kind of makes sense that if you're going to leave the country, you're probably doing so because you dislike the government somewhat. And not only that, if you are in the United States, you are very likely going to be from a pretty privileged sector because even just the flight alone to the United States is out of reach for most people in Venezuela. It's a very expensive thing, let alone the visa, let alone, trying to find a job or trying to buy or whatever a house in the United States. So the sort of people we're going to be interacting with in Europe or in the United States who are from Venezuela very likely come from a certain privileged upper class sector of the country who, quite frankly, have had their power challenged and in some cases taken away ever since the Bolivarian Revolution. And of course they don't like that. Of course they don't. And so they see the increased equality that's going on in Venezuela as a form of terrible oppression being meted out against them by a dictatorship.
Yeah, and so I have been scrolling through here. Let me bring this up. Through like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, different NGOs who report on human rights violations, and the most recent one compared to like what we're seeing coming out of like Iran or Israel, it doesn't seem as like stark, but there are still like grounds to believe that like there is persecution of political opponents, arrests, and torture. I saw like one of the some of the reporting coming out of Venezuela I saw is that like 2,000 opposition protesters were rounded up and taken to re-education centers, which are essentially torture camps. I haven't been able to verify any of that, but that's been going around online as well. Alleged extrajudicial killings, armed groups, and one of the things was there's an alleged like media crackdown of anti-government or opposition journalists and anti-government news outlets getting shut down. So I was wondering what your experience was that, if it's overstated. What is freedom of the press like?
Well, I mean, they've been making these claims for nearly a quarter century now, and sometimes just turning on television country is pretty relevant. When I was doing my PhD about Venezuela and the Venezuelan media, it was said that it was one of the most cowed in the world, that people were totally under pressure, that they were living in fear as journalists. But the minute you actually turn on a television in Venezuela and you see people demanding things that would never even be thought of in the United States, let alone broadcast, open calls to overthrow the president, to shoot people, to get out on the streets. The media in Venezuela for decades was the driving force behind so many of the coups against the government, including open calls to assassinate the president. A lot of the calls and a lot of the information about Venezuela when it comes to human rights or political persecution is perhaps sometimes true in a vacuum, but with the context, it makes much more sense. So one of the main claims is that opposition candidates, Maria Corina Machado, has been blocked from participating in politics, and this is seen as an enormous stain against the country. But they never really inform you why she was blocked from participating. And the reason is that she traveled the world for years trying to organize a US-led invasion force against her own country, unsuccessfully in the end. She also petitioned the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu for Israel to invade Venezuela as well. She led a years-long campaign of terroristic violence, which I saw a tiny part of when I was in Venezuela, but they were called guarimbas, and what that meant was basically people blocking roads, setting fire to things, burning people, garroting people in public, putting up razor wire across their checkpoints that, literally beheaded people in the streets, burning down hospitals, burning down schools, attacking kindergartens, attacking orphanages, the sorts of really, frankly, pretty ISIS-like violence that has been going on. And these human rights organizations are absolutely uninterested in reporting on that kind of violence because it doesn't fit into their narrative of government bad, NGOs good. And the thing about NGOs in Venezuela is that a gigantic proportion of them are actually being funded by the United States government through groups like the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED. And this has been going on for decades now. And they've got this whole network of NED-sponsored, quote-unquote, human rights organizations that exist in Venezuela that pump out report after report of really exaggerated claims about what's going on in the country, and totally one-sided as well, because they're never interested in looking at opposition violence. And it's very disappointing to see Amnesty and Human Rights Watch team up with these groups. And it's doubly disappointing that those sorts of groups don't want to look at United States attacks on human rights and just general human rights in Venezuela. What about the rights to food? What about the right to housing? They don't seem interested in really looking at the sanctions as one of the main human rights violations going on right now. One United Nations Special Rapporteur, Alfred de Zayas, an American, by the way, went to Venezuela and looked at the American sanctions, and he compared them to being akin to a medieval siege, he said, and said that the United States was probably, he said he was likely guilty of crimes against humanity, and estimated that 100,000 Venezuelans had died because of these sanctions. And yet Human Rights Watch and Amnesty are completely uninterested at looking at these sorts of things, and instead focus laser-like on government violations. But they don't seem to be interested in looking at the context of this. So you were talking about lots of people being arrested. Well, I mean, what's been going on since the elections is the opposition has launched another campaign of violence. They attempted to burn down a hospital while I was there. They burned down buildings, attacked a pharmacy in Caracas, which was dispensing cheap drugs to underprivileged communities, burned down local government buildings. Another thing that hasn't got any play in the media is that armed opposition groups on motorbikes actually attacked a motorcade of foreign dignitaries and election observers and forced the bus to turn around and go back to the hotel, fleeing because they overpowered the police. And that bus had to go back, and all those foreign dignitaries missed their flight. But that I don't think that's even been reported in the media. I think it's had a few one-off comments from people like myself. But I mean, if that happened in the US election where Trumpian people basically held up a bunch of, foreign diplomats, that would be headline news for weeks, but just completely uninterested when it's the wrong side doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there's a lot of thought termination when you say to the American public and the European public, oh, they're communists, and then all critical thinking shuts down, kind of like the word terrorist as well. So I guess the assertion that I see online is that U.S. sanctions aren't really targeted. That's not what's causing this massive inflation in Venezuela. There's other complicating factors. There's like, capitalists within Venezuela extracting like cash money out of the country, then converting it in like places like Colombia. So it's taken out of the economy in its entirety. It's not just the sanctions, but how do you account for the state of the Venezuelan economy? Is it just sanctions? Is it the government? Is it corrupt corporations and businessmen within Venezuela? A combination of all three? Because if just looking at the inflation rates alone, like I guess like people's knee-jerk reaction in the West would be to just like blame socialism out of hand. And that's definitely not the entirety of the picture.
So, I talked to a lot of opposition people, and they tended to downplay the sanctions a lot. In some cases, some people said that the sanctions were only targeting the government and hadn't had an effect on Venezuelan population at all. Yet, if you read American reports themselves, they're boasting about how much effect these sanctions have had on the Venezuelan economy. And in fact, if you actually read what the point of the sanctions are, there are documents that have been released about this. U.S. sanctions, this is specifically about Cuba, but you can obviously relate this to Venezuela as well. They said that sanctions are supposed to bring about hardship, hunger, and an overthrow of the population. And that is exactly what's going on in Venezuela. As I said, those sanctions are responsible for killing over 100,000 people, according to this UN special rapporteur. The sanctions have caused, according to a Venezuelan a Venezuelan opposition economist who advises the opposition, it caused a 99% reduction in Venezuela's foreign earnings, and that's because the oil industry basically collapsed. And the reason it collapsed was it was so intertwined with the United States. All the spare parts and stuff needed to come from the US. And that just dried up. So after a few years, the oil industry sputtered to a halt. Yeah, I mean, just think about any country that loses 99% of its international income, and just imagine what that's going to look like. Corporations and countries alike are very scared of trading with Venezuela, else they'd be hit with secondary sanctions. If you trade with Venezuela, your company can't trade in the United States or with the United States. And if you're in a corporation, for example, that has any subsidiaries, if one of your subsidiaries trades with Venezuela, then they're hit. There's massive shortages of medicine even to this day. So the sanctions have certainly had an enormous effect on the economy, a terrible and debilitating effect, in fact. Certainly we can talk about government corruption or mismanagement of the economy, but I think in the cold light of 2024, it's becoming increasingly obvious that the sanctions were the main cause and overwhelming cause of the difficulty in Venezuela, because lest we not forget, between 2002 and 2013, the economy was absolutely roaring. And if socialism was so bad right now, why was it so good back then? Before the sanctions, unemployment reached record low figures, poverty was cut in half, extreme poverty was cut by 3/4, illiteracy was eradicated, hunger was completely eradicated. The UN even gave Venezuela a special prize for eradicating hunger, the best out of any country in the world. Back in, I think it was 2012, they gave it to them. And that was just a couple of years before the United States really started turning the screw with the sanctions, which is actually under the Obama administration, but then continued on in the Trump administration now with Biden as well. Nevertheless, I would say that in the last few years, the economy has really recovered remarkably as Venezuela has found ways around sanctions by trading with countries like Iran, Russia, China. Those sorts of countries have really helped Venezuela start to turn the tide. So now we have a situation where more than 96% of the food that Venezuelans eat comes from it's self-grown. There's been a remarkable improvements in the quality of life in the last few years from the absolute nadir of, the 2019, 2020 times. So it seems that the government is starting to get over these sanctions, and maybe the proof will be in the pudding in the coming years to see if they can start improving the economy even more.
Well, we've kind of seen this global trend in sanctions not working. They are kind of one of their main purposes is, as you said, to force regime change in coordination with more intelligence-based information operations to stir up a resistance against the government that's in power. But they really haven't been working like they used to. Russia, that's doing fine. Iran is more economically viable than ever. And yeah, I think there is hope that even though the sanctions don't seem like they'll be repealed from the United States, there are ways around them. They are less effective than they would be. One thing I wanted to touch on is then the accusation of like this government corruption, because that's one of the main narratives that we see in like CNN, MSNBC, Fox, that it's a corrupt socialist government full of cronyism, nepotism. And I was just wondering what your experience was that, and how did the Chavistas view it? Because we know how the opposition views it.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you have honest and frank conversations with the Chavistas, they'll say, there is some cronyism or some corruption. But honestly, I don't see that as completely out of the ordinary for Latin America or even for anywhere in the world. So I think these sorts of claims about corruption are a little bit overblown, especially when you compare it to the widespread and rampant corruption that was baked into the system before the Chavistas came to power. So I often think it's a bit, pot calling the kettle black when people from opposition parties who were in power for decades, presided over the most staggering corruption imaginable, are now talking about corruption being this gigantic problem. It's like it wasn't a problem when those guys were in power and, sharing the monies between themselves, but suddenly when they're locked out of power, then it's this terrible thing that's blighting the economy. So when it comes to corruption, yes, I think it's in the eye of the beholder. One amazing example of this is the case of Alex Saab, this Venezuelan businessman who became a diplomat, and he was sent over to Iran on a mission to boost trade between Venezuela and Iran and really get around the sanctions. And when he was coming back from his diplomatic mission, the United States actually stopped his plane over in Cabo Verde, a bunch of islands just off the west coast of Africa, and actually took him off the plane and marched him all the way over to Florida and held him for years. And all of this was supposed to be done because Alex Saab was a corrupt businessman. But I can't imagine, since when did the United States care about, Alex Saab defrauding the Venezuelan government by charging them too much? It's absolutely patently ludicrous on its face that the United States is somehow, deeply cares about corruption inside the Venezuelan economy. And indeed, he was held for years, and he was finally released quite recently on some sort of prisoner exchange for a bunch of CIA guys that Venezuela had managed to capture operating in their own country. So yeah, I think the short answer is that, well, corruption exists there, but corruption is a problem in most societies. And suddenly it's only in Venezuela or other nations targeted for regime change that the United States really seems to care about corruption.
Yeah, and this is kind of a theme with U.S. foreign policy. There are some terrorists that we care about, some terrorists that we don't. We have mutable definitions where we choose to care, where we choose to get involved. And so, what for people just coming into this subject, what makes Venezuela so appealing for the United States interest?
Well, if you want a one-word answer, I could say oil. Venezuela has the largest proven oil reserves in the entire world, larger than Saudi Arabia, larger than Iraq, Iran, any country you really want to name. But I think that's slightly superficial, if not. It's not wrong, but it's very much incomplete. I think perhaps the main thing is that Venezuela poses an extraordinary threat to the United States in the language of the White House, and the reason it provides an extraordinary threat is the threat of a good example. It is one of the leaders in this push for a multipolar world, trying to push Latin America and, in fact, the rest of the world into a different future. Chavez, the former president, was very much a visionary on this sense in the world stage. And, he, for example, was the person who reinvigorated OPEC. OPEC was pretty much a dormant, dead organization until Chavez came to power and did this whistle-stop tour of the Middle East, of Russia, and really got those countries to start working together to try to help their own countries. More than that, though, Venezuela has also helped a lot of countries in Latin America. They've got this real sense of saying that they can never have true independence from the United States unless Latin American and Caribbean countries act as one. So they're really pushing this sense of Latin American unity. They set up all sorts of organizations like ALBA, which is the Bolivarian People's Alliance, this alternative group of nations in South America and the Caribbean. They helped set up CELAC, which is an organization of Latin American and Caribbean states. Every single country in the Western Hemisphere is a member, except the United States and Canada, who are expressly barred from joining. And that was really, these things are set up as counterweights to try to provide a substitute for and eventually get rid of organizations like the OAS, which is seen as very much just a puppet of the United States. Venezuela has also teamed up and forged links with other countries that they are on the United States naughty list, like China, like Russia, and like Iran. And so it really poses a serious threat in the sense that this old idea about the domino theory, that if you let one country to go socialist, then they will all turn that way. That actually has some merit, I think. If the United States doesn't keep playing whack-a-mole with all these governments that come up and keep threatening to use the resources of those countries to help the people, then they could have a huge problem on their hands if too many of them get out of control. And so that's really the reason that Venezuela has been an obsession for people in Washington for the past 25 years, because they are really scared that the ideas that have been put into practice in Venezuela might spread. And, we've seen extraordinary things happening in Venezuela, like, as I mentioned before, Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro used the oil wealth of the country to fund enormous social programs. I visited some social housing there. The government there has built over 5 million social houses in the last 14 years alone, and that's for a country of 20-something million people. So these slums that were this endemic problem across Venezuela and across Latin America more generally have really been had the sting taken out of them. People have homes. There's a huge university population there. As I said before, between 2002 and 2013, poverty was reduced by half. Extreme poverty was cut by 3/4. Illiteracy was completely eradicated there. There was all sorts of programs going on there, all these sorts of progressive things that Americans, a lot of people on the American left like to dream of happening in the US, were actually being put into place in a much poorer country with far fewer resources. And so if it's possible for Venezuela to do that, why is it not possible for the rest of the world to do that? And that's really the terrible and dangerous question that Venezuela was asking. And it was putting across the proof that there is a big lie going on, that this is the best of all possible worlds. Well, actually, another world is possible, and smaller countries were putting that into practice. And if more and more people in the West and in the United States specifically knew what was going on in a lot of these countries, they wouldn't stand for the terrible conditions that they have to put up with in their own society.
No. And, if some aspects of the Venezuelan government economy were working in some ways like that, that would be incredibly dangerous. I do think the egregious amount of coups and military interventions that have happened in South America and Central America under the guise of fighting communism It's kind of astounding. And what we've seen is that we are still on that Cold War foreign policy footing, because a lot of our politicians who are still in office are literally grew up in that age, and they still see the world that way. I certainly do think that Biden does. That's just one thing. So going forward, it's definitely not in the U.S. interest to see a Venezuelan socialist project succeed, especially because they've wanted to project dominance and hegemony over the American continent since forever, and so since even before the First World Wars. So where now that we have a couple minutes left, where do you see this election drama going? Is there any predictions? Like, do you think it will resolve? Obviously, the accusations of it being completely rigged and the government being completely corrupt, and Maduro being a left-wing dictator will still persist. But how do you see this playing out in the near future?
Well, we see this every election, frankly, that every election that the government wins, I should say, because the opposition have won 2 major elections since 2007, and the government immediately accepted the results there and just let the opposition win those. But the ones that the government does win, there's a common practice where the opposition refuses to acknowledge the result. They get backing from the United States and often from Europe, and then the process is this long, drawn-out one where the opposition tries to mobilize its people onto the streets, tries to persuade the military and the police to rebel and overthrow the government for them, or tries to persuade the United States to intervene militarily. And they've never really been able to really pull that one off. There's a lot of accusations from the opposition about electoral shenanigans. They haven't. I mean, they created this whole website where they, have all these figures that clash with the government ones, but it's not really clear what those figures are based on. I spoke to opposition activists, and they were showing me all these numbers coming in. But what they come from is just people looking at the count and doing the count themselves, like looking at the paper ballots, and then just sending WhatsApp messages to some big central WhatsApp group for each district, and then the opposition just publishing those as gospel. Of course, if they just even if they make a mistake on their phone, that immediately invalidates the results. But more than that, I mean, that system is rife for corruption. I saw a lot of the results coming in that showed that Gonzales has been winning, 10 times as many votes as Maduro, which seemed highly suspicious. So I guess in the short term, I would like to see the government publish the full actos, as they're called, and that should, once that happens, start to dampen any sort of massive resentment in the country. If they're able to do that, the faster the better. I think a lot of foreign countries will accept the results of the election. The United States hasn't really had much success persuading other countries in the region to join an anti-Venezuela alliance over this. It seems that Maduro's victory, which was nearly 9 points, was probably just too big for a lot of people to go along with this idea that there was this huge fraud and Mr. Maduro stole the elections. So I think the opposition violence and the opposition street protests that we've seen are probably not going to be able to topple the government. And so we're going to be in this situation where, the United States might continue to recognize some sort of parallel government like they did with Juan Guaido, but I'm really not convinced that they're going to be able to convince that many countries to go along with it. And so ultimately, I think this will probably peter out, although it might drag on interminably. And we might have a Juan Guaido 2.0 situation, which would be, to be fair, the funniest of all possible scenarios, because Venezuelan politics is probably the most cursed and silliest and most ridiculous of any country going in the world.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see. Thank you so much for coming on and spending this much time talking about such a contentious subject. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great to talk to you.
All right. See you next time. Okay. So That was a pretty solid interview. We're in the Q&A phase right now, y'all, and let's start. We knew there was going to be some contention on this subject. Here's a great comment. This is the fake left. You only excuse you not to debate real Marxists is they aren't important enough for you. But you couldn't even give 1 minute laugh emoji. So that's a lie. Cowards. Okay. Thanks for your input. Awesome. Sick. Okay. When a country is under sanctions for years, it is bound to hurt the population of that country. A similar situation is Cuba, a country blockaded for 6 decades. Yeah, well, you know, one of the basic premises, as we discussed in this episode, is sanctions are meant to target a government so that it makes either the actual government officials' lives so difficult by freezing their assets overseas, making sure they can't travel to certain countries, targeting their class privilege on one level to make them comply with policies that the United States in this instance wants them to do. So you saw that with a bunch of targeted individual sanctions on people, how the United States, a bunch of conservative Republicans, representatives wanted to target ICC officials and their families to deny them access to the United States. That's technically a sanction. It's a really petty one, but that's a sanction. So it can target individuals and countries. So individuals is trying to compel them to toe the line with policy that the United States wants. Sanctioning countries targets the population so that, and it's done in conjunction with information operations, generally done by the CIA-backed opposition that we see sometimes in Venezuela. And that is to create a coup to install a more far-right government that will serve better American interests. So Cuba's been resilient. They've been under sanctions for 6 decades. Venezuela, Iran, you know, the United States has 1/3 of the world under some sanctions to various and lesser degrees of severity. And, you know, the sanctions, they're not working like they used to. So that's just a testament to the degradation of American hard power. Because hard power is military and economic force. And we just don't have either like we used to, which is probably good for the entire planet. Is Bolivia against Venezuela? So in 2019, Venezuela and Bolivia's diplomatic relations were interrupted after a violent coup d'etat that saw former President Evo Morales. Evo Morales, he was like ousted from power, right? However, in 2020, I'm a bad Texan because I cannot pronounce, like, I'm horrible at Spanish and Spanish names. Luis Arce from the Socialist Party of Bolivia won, and the presidential elections kind of restored ties between one socialist party and another in both countries with Caracas. So this is, I think Maduro traveled to Bolivia a number of times, 3 times, and they signed oil and gas agreements with this new administration, and like education agreements, and a lot of bilateral organizations are happening between Bolivia and Venezuela. So they're not currently, to use the precise political term, beefing. The CIA is a terrorist organization. Not going to fight you on that. That's not dying on that hill. Greg, can Alan or you explain that this is part of the boomerang effect? And all the U.S.'s interference in other countries' affairs comes back to us. Yeah, I mean, the system of empire and imperialism always first disproportionately affects people overseas in the global south, but everything that happens affects the citizens of empire. That's why we're all connected. So when I talk the most about the imperial boomerang, where methods of colonial repression, like policing, are field tested overseas in the colonies, like Israel. So the same technology used to enforce apartheid and occupation on Palestinians, including techniques, spyware, policing methods, weapons, are eventually, because they work, and the powers that be are like, hey, these work. If we use them over there, why wouldn't we use them over here? Because again, police are born out of counterinsurgency forces, imperial counterinsurgency forces in Northern Ireland, and slave patrols in the Caribbean and the Carolinas. So yes, that the same thing, the same structures and the same technology that is used to oppress people overseas comes back to empire. That's why we call it the boomerang, because you throw it over there first and it comes back this way. And so one of the another boomerang effect is the migrant crisis. Yes, there's a ton of, I grew up around a ton of Venezuelans in Austin, Texas, and they had to flee the country because of economic conditions related to United States sanctions. And of course, we've also a lot of Venezuelan populations where I live. And a lot of those Venezuelans left because we were installing far-right death squads in conjunction with Israel in the 80s to fight against Russian influence. And so, and those violent goon squads still exist and persecute people politically and stuff. So yeah, that's another boomerang effect. What the conservatives like to call the immigrant crisis, while simultaneously refusing to think that, refusing to acknowledge that we're a big part of that through wars, regime change, and economic sanctions, that people have no choice but to come and seek asylum in America. Because I don't know why guys with "Don't Tread on Me" flags can't grasp the concept that people don't want to leave their country if they have any choice. They don't want to leave their land. You know, all these libertarians who are so obsessed with private property, they can't imagine that people would actually just like to stay where they live. I think they buy into the huge propaganda that America is like this great country and land of opportunity, and it still is to some degree, but it's not your birthright. What else we got? Oh yeah, full medical with dental here in Colombia. Sometimes they charge $3 a month. I broke 2 ribs playing rugby in India, and x-rays only cost like $3, and that was awesome. So, okay, is that due to more countries having more resources? Well, the thing is, you could say that the capitalist system and other governments are kind of driven by resource exploitation. That's just the nature of establishing power and influence, but no one does it like a strictly finance capital countries. And yeah, it's mostly it's generally resource driven. There's also geostrategic concerns, like Alan touched on. It's not just about the resources in Venezuela. It's about fearing a pink or a red domino effect, where if Venezuela is allowed to stay socialist, then other Latin American countries will be socialist, which are anti-capitalist, which they nationalize their resources, which bars access to resources from foreign powers. And yeah, it's just not something the U.S. wants. The U.S. doesn't want to treat fairly with the Latin American countries or any country. They just want to impose sanctions, bend them to their will, and they want to privatize the resources. So, yeah, that's the big rub with Venezuela. And I will say that there are some legitimate complaints with the Maduro government for sure. But as citizens of the West, we have to hold our government accountable for putting the boot on their neck. So there's that. Okay, guys, I think we are out of time. Sorry, we didn't have enough time for as much time for questions. It was a longer interview. So I hope that was helpful. That was just a kind of a easy primer to envision the different factors at play with the Venezuelan elections. Again, it's going to peter out. He's going to remain in power, and the controversy is going to die down. Again, I don't think the Biden administration is going to die on the hill by trying to elect and declare a shadow president. So that's cool. Aside from that, the current push into Russia by Ukraine is not going to achieve any strategic goals. We're still waiting on the Iranian response. And Kamala Harris is going to have to do some damage control about that faux pas she made at the convention in Detroit. So thanks so much for watching, y'all. We're going to call it this evening, and we'll see you on Monday, and we'll do our weekly political roll-up from whatever crazy insanity happens every weekend now, because it's 2024 and it's going to get worse before it gets worse. Thanks y'all so much for watching, and we will see you next week on State of Play on MintPress News. And we're on Patreon, by the way. Cheers, y'all.